Good afternoon, everyone, and a warm welcome to this CIPFA webinar, where we're going to be talking about council tax collection, council tax reform in the era of COVID-19. My name is Vivian Russell. I'm Head of Communications, Content and Events at CIPFA, and I'll be moderating today's discussion. Council tax, obviously something that's a hot topic, particularly here at CIPFA, and for many CIPFA members, particularly those in local government, as it's a really important revenue stream for councils. Many of you know that CIPFA carries out an annual council tax survey to gauge what's going on across the country, what councils are planning to do in terms of raising the council tax, at least within the space the government allows them to. This year's research showed that in England, average council tax bills are set to rise by 4.3% in the next financial year. It's just over £78 per annum on the bill. That, of course, masks some considerable regional variations, and we'll be hearing more about what those look like later in the hour. In Wales, it's a slightly different story again. Average council tax increases are about 3.9%, according to the CIPFA survey. So council tax is a key plank in the local government finance system, which we know remains under considerable pressure. And today we're going to be hearing a bit more about the CIPFA research, those regional variations, the impact of the social care preset, but also we'll be having, I think, a chat about some of the bigger questions about the council tax and the case for reform. Before I introduce today's speakers, I just want to remind everyone that we want this to be an interactive event. This is an opportunity for you to put your questions and comments forward and to allow our speakers to respond and discuss. So you are able to ask questions via the submit a question panel, which you should be able to see on the GoToWebinar dashboard that you should have on your screen. And once presentations have concluded, I'll put those forward to our speakers and we'll have a discussion. You can submit a question at any time you like. Don't feel that you have to wait until the end of the presentation. So if something occurs to you while someone is in mid-flow, that's not a problem. Just pop your question in the box. So to talk about this subject today, we've got two great speakers. We have Joanne Pitt, who is Local Government Policy Manager here at CIPFA, and David Phillips, who's Associate Director at the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Our first speaker is Jo. Jo's got 25 years of public sector experience, and she's a strong advocate for financial management and good governance in local government. At CIPFA, she led on the delivery of the Financial Management Code, which we published in 2019, and she speaks and writes regularly on these topics. So Jo's going to be our first speaker. Jo, over to you.
Thanks, Viv, and a very good afternoon to everybody who's taken the time, and I really appreciate that you've done that, to take the time to listen to the council tax reform in the age of COVID-19. I've got a couple of slides for you, and I'm going to sort of chat maybe for about 10 minutes. The intention will be just to talk you through what our findings were from the survey, because it's important just to understand the landscape of council tax. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about the funding implications for council tax and why there are some areas that in CIPFA we're a little bit concerned about at the moment, and we want to ensure that they're transparent. And then just take you on until a little bit about the reforms, which David will then lead on to. So, first slide, please, Viv, if you can. Right, this is about our council tax survey, and we did sort of three things out of that briefing. It's actually available on the CIPFA website, so we'll send you details after the event if you haven't seen it already. It's just sort of fairly easy, about 6 pages of council tax information, really, so it'll be helpful if you wanted to read it. What we did was we identified the additional pressures on funding that are now part of the local government landscape. we looked at that in the context of some of the possible solutions that local authorities might take if they weren't able to raise the council tax that they needed to raise. And then that led on to the conversation about the need for reform and the fact that council tax is heavily dependent at the moment. We're heavily dependent on it for raising sort of £31 billion, and there are concerns that it is being stretched too far, and that it's particularly difficult for those who are in an income bracket where they're not on benefits, but they're just about above that that income band, and we call it a regressive type of tax. I mean, just an example of that is, I did a few stats here to say that the first year of the introduction of adult social care precept, so that was when the government introduced the additional precept that would be ring-fenced to spend on adult social care, the average Band D council tax was 1,530. By 2021-22, that's risen to £1,884. So that's an increase of about 23%. But if you'd actually kept pace with inflation, you'd be looking nearer at 1,666. So, you know, you can just see that the rises in council tax are considerable. Next page, please. Right, I've got two slides here. So this one's on regional variations, and I'm going to talk you through that. And then the second one is on tier variations, because it's quite important to see how that happens and works across the sort of council tax landscape. You can see on the right-hand side that we've got a chart here which takes the data from the survey that we did, showing the increases in those bands, who had the greatest increases across and who had the least. So you can see there that Greater London tops that by having the highest increase this year for council tax. So the lowest percentage of increases are in the east of England, and that represented a sort of 3.5% increase average across the piece in the east of England. So that showed to be about a £64 increase if you actually put it on monetary value. Then you went next to the northeast. Now the northeast's increase was only about 3.6%, so only a small 0.1% above the east of England. But because the starting level of council tax as an average basis in the northeast is greater, what we're saying is that then this equates to an increase of £71 per year in comparison to the £64 experienced in the east of England. The percentage rises was much greater in Greater London, and that was in part attributed to the rise in transport costs. But the council tax rise in the northeast was 1.8% less than in Greater London, but you still have council tax payers in the northeast paying a considerable amount more on average than Greater London, because Greater London's starting point was significantly lower. You've got £2,029 in the northeast compared with the sort of Greater London average of 1,616. There is a concern that the increasing reliance on percentage increases will just continue to exacerbate this divergence in council tax across these regions. When you put it into a context of sort of levelling up, that probably doesn't sit very, very well with the agenda for central government, because as you go on across the years, that will continue, because at no point are we going to see a sort of suddenly, you know, the northeast probably not being able to put up council tax unless there was a substantial income from somewhere else. I haven't got Scotland on here, but interestingly, if you think about some of these divergence, sometimes they were caused regionally when local authorities took council tax freezes. So you go back a number of years, the government offered council tax freezes for those organisations and authorities who didn't put up council tax. So they start from a much lower base, and their divergence, when you talk about percentage increases, is even greater. If you take you back to Northampton, Northamptonshire County Council will give an additional increase when they experienced acute financial difficulties a couple of years ago onto their council tax, and they had taken council tax freeze income money so that they were percentage-wise on a much lower base than some of their other neighbours. Interestingly, in Scotland this year, they were offered funding for sort of a council tax freeze, which that wasn't available in England. Viv, can you move on to the tier variation, please? So when we talk about tier variation, this is the variation between the different types of authority. So Greater London councils increased by the highest rate. So that's probably very similar, as I've just said, geographically. So you're looking at a 5.4% increase. So that's £82. In contrast to this, though, non-metropolitan authorities increased by an average of 3.8%. So they kept their percentage increases lower, but still, because they're starting from a higher point, often their bills were significantly higher. Then you've got the added complication within council tax of adult social care precepts. So these were introduced a few years ago and are ring-fence funding for adult social care. There is a whole other conversation about the funding for adult social care, so that's for another day. But it is important to recognise that this plays an element within that conversation. So in 2021-22, the Northwest region saw the largest increases in adult social care precept. So that was £40.87 out of a total increase that they had of £78. Whilst in contrast, the Southwest saw a large total increase for the Band D council tax of £87, but attributed £36.66 to adult social care. So there's also, within council tax itself, that flexibility, and we're seeing differentials in council tax raising ability for adult social care. It's important that we recognise that some of the ability to raise funding for adult social care, while very welcome, is quite difficult, because a significant amount of that might be raised in areas where it is not linked particularly with need. So there is a discussion needed to be had about the ability to raise funding for adult social care and where that is needed. And within council tax, that is not particularly clear. Vic, can I have another slide, please? The survey also raised some questions about the local government finance settlement and the concept of core spending. One of the things that was identified was that the council tax requirement was based on a number of assumptions around level of increase in council tax and the council tax base growth. Now, these are inbuilt into the government's assumptions, and it suggests and assumes that local authorities will raise council tax by the maximum that they are allowed. Now, the difficulty you've got is that if you think about council tax rises in the context of COVID, local authorities were always going to be challenged as to how they could increase council tax to those maximum amounts, whilst a lot of the individuals within their communities will be suffering financial hardship. So in 2021-22, the maximums just under 2% council tax and under 3% for adult social care premiums. And we do see from the fact that the average council tax rises with 4.3 that councils haven't raised over the course of the country, haven't raised to the maximum council tax. So what that does is that then has left a gap in funding that we calculated at about sort of £200 million on top of some of the challenges that local authorities are already facing as part of their funding and the need to balance their books. So there needs perhaps to be a consideration of those assumptions going forward to ensure that there is not an increase in the funding gap that local authorities face. Thanks. Viv, can I have the other slide? Now, responding to COVID, we'll probably talk about this as we look through and talk through the questions, but we've got issues about council tax collection going forward, and I know David's going to cover a lot of that, so I won't dwell too much on that. But what we've also got is issues around increases in people who are becoming reliant on council tax. So I just took this out of the government details last week when they produced information on council tax and support. So you can see from the figures here that you've got increasing numbers, interestingly and hardly unsurprising, in working age. And when you think about furlough coming to an end, that is probably going to increase and place additional pressures on local authorities, both providing for council tax support, but also for those in the community that are going to struggle to pay council tax, perhaps where they've got reduced hours and different circumstances. So responding to COVID is going to be quite difficult over the next couple of months. And just finally, before I pass over to David, we're looking forward to reform. We talk about a need for cross-party support. Hopefully we'll pick some of these up in the questions. We want to talk about history not repeating itself, because we've had a lot of work going forward. And there's lots of thought here about short-term changes. Perhaps we can discuss those in questions, and considerations for long-term opportunities, you know, income tax, proportionate property tax. What's your views? So that's a canter through the survey, and hopefully I'll pass over to David now to pick up on some of those and talk through in more detail.
Thanks, Jo. Just before we move on to David, just a quick reminder, just please a quick reminder to just submit your questions at any time. You can see that some are already starting to come in, which is great. We've only got 2 speakers today, so hopefully we'll have quite a decent amount of time to have some sort of questions and discussion after David's presentation. Okay, so I will delighted to introduce our second speaker, who is David Phillips. David is Associate Director at the IFS, where he leads work on devolved and local government finance, with a particular focus on the distribution of funding and the various incentives and risks at play that come with those different funding regimes. David, over to you.
Great, thank you. Have I got control of the slides as well?
You should have. Let's give it a go. If not, I will happily move them on for you.
Yes, I do. Great. So first of all, let me say it's a real pleasure to be here with you today, at least virtually. Hopefully we can have these sort of things in person again soon. Although I'll have to get used to wearing trousers rather than just gym shorts, which I've got very much used to during these webinars, sort of taking advantage of what newsreaders do. So I really do envy Hugh Edwards after all of this. But anyway, in the next 15 minutes or so, I want to talk about a few key issues for council tax. First, how council tax has performed during the COVID-19 crisis. We'll see it seems to have actually weathered the storm better than initially expected. Second, we'll look at the role council tax is and can play in future in tackling rising spending pressures that councils are facing. And in particular, the impact this could have on poorer households and poorer places. And finally, third, we'll look at how council tax can help tackle inequalities and contribute to the levelling up agenda. So first of all, let's look at council tax during the COVID-19 crisis. Obviously, I think you'll all know that council tax revenues have been hit hard by the COVID-19 crisis, but they've been hit less hard than initially expected. So, this chart here shows councils' forecasts of the full year impact of the COVID-19 crisis on their council tax. It's an estimate of the reduction in their council tax collections. And you can see back in May and June of last year, they were expecting about £1.7, £1.8 billion less council tax to be collected in the year just finishing. By February, the most recent estimates, it was about £1.1 billion they were expecting to be collected less. So the sort of estimates of the losses in council tax have come down by about a third over the last 8-9 months. We can talk about a bit more of that in the questions, but I think there's kind of a couple of factors explaining this. One is that the rise in unemployment has been less significant than expected, with the furlough scheme extended. I think second, the self-employed have received more support than was expected at that time. And third, I think the hardship fund has probably helped support payments from those getting council tax support, because that council tax support is more generous. So councils having to collect less off of those people who are receiving council tax support, a group they often struggle to collect the council tax due. And of course, it's worth mentioning the government will cover 3/4 of the shortfall remaining. And I think there's a kind of, sometimes people are questioned, why is it 3/4, not 100%? And I think that is because councils will then still have an incentive to collect the arrears on those tax bills. If it was 100% compensation, councils wouldn't have that financial incentive to collect unpaid bills and arrears. Now, the second point to bear in mind, looking at the kind of impact of COVID-19, is that whilst the impact has been less than expected, it has been quite high, and it's been particularly high in poorer parts of the country. And that can be seen on this figure here. So this figure shows the shortfall in council tax revenues measured as a percentage of what councils are forecasting to collect before the crisis. And you can see that for the most deprived fifth of councils, those losses are around 5 to 5.5% of council tax revenues. For the least deprived, they're just under 3% of council tax revenues. So the impact has been almost twice as high in the most deprived councils in terms of the shortfall in council tax revenues. Now, having said that, the less deprived areas rely more on their council tax for overall funding. So if we look at the impact as a percentage of their core spending power, we see a much more even effect across councils. So it's about 2 to 2.5% right across councils, depending on their levels of deprivation. It can be more or less for some individual councils, but there's no strong correlation in the sort of shortfall in council tax as a percentage of overall funding across levels of deprivation, at least. And I think what that is kind of indicated is, deprived areas have seen bigger falls in their council tax collections, but have been somewhat protected by the fact that they rely less on those revenues for their overall funding. I think the kind of third point with COVID is that councils will raise less in the coming financial year than the government has assumed because of the COVID crisis. The first is obviously, while councils are raising the council tax by less than the full 5% in many cases, and as Joe said, that's particularly the case in Shire county areas. But more importantly, And I think outside of councils' control is the fact that COVID means that their forecasting will be more CTS claimants and more non-payment of tax, not just in the year it is finishing, but next year as well. In fact, the number of CTS claimants is likely to rise further with the rise in unemployment. I think the upshot of that is that the tax base is set to fall by an average 0.5% per year, not grow by 1.7% a year, as MHELG had assumed. And that's a difference of around £700 million. So core spending power will not go up, by £2.2 billion next year. It's more likely to be more like £1.5 billion in the coming year, largely because of the impact of COVID reducing the amount raised through tax-based growth. And that brings us to the second point I wanted to talk about in my presentation, and that is the issues of relying on council tax to meet rising costs of council services. Council tax will be 61% of council's core spending power in 2021-22, up from 49% in 2015-16, and around 40% in 2009-10. So the contribution to council tax really has increased a lot over the last decade as grant funding was cut, and then since the ends of the freezes in the sort of early 2010s, council tax rates have gone up, raising more. So council tax is much more important for council's budgets than it was. And in fact, 85% of the, I just mentioned, over-optimistic assumed funding increases for 2021-22 come from what the government was assuming would come from council tax. I think there are kind of two key issues from this. And I think those issues have become more serious because of the spending envelopes set out in the budget this year. In the budget this year, the Chancellor set out a spending envelope which involved spending around £14 billion less on unprotected service areas than was planned before the COVID crisis from 2022-23 onwards. Now, of course, government can still look at this in a spending review. I'm sure they will. But at least given the current spending envelopes, once you exclude the kind of ending of the COVID funding, so just focusing on core government funding, whilst overall funding for day-to-day spending will go up by 2.1% in real terms, a range of protected services like schools, the NHS, defence will see increases of 4.4%. The OBR says that means a 1% cut to everything else in the coming year. But that doesn't account for the Barnett formula, which guarantees Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland some additional funding. So for other unprotected services like MHELG, the cut will be about 3.1% in real terms. I said the government is likely to top this up. This doesn't seem very reasonable, but at least as it stands, that could mean, not increases to grant funding for councils, but cuts to grant funding. So that means even greater reliance on council tax. So the issues that arise from that will become more significant. I think the first issue is that council tax hits low and middle income households harder, in part because of the current structure, which is regressive with respect to property values. So this chart shows the percentage of people's income that they pay in council tax, according to whether they are the poorest 10% of the population, right up to the richest 10% of the population. And we can see here that before council tax support is taken into account, council tax makes up nearly 10% of income for the poorest tenth of the population, compared to about 2% for the richest tenth. Now, council tax support does offset, much of these differences, but if we look at this figure, it's still the case that the poorest half of the population, the poor and the middle income groups, spend about 4% of their income on council tax after accounting for council tax support. It's about 2% for the top 10% of the population. So relying on council tax rather than relying, for example, on income tax or national insurance to raise additional funding and giving that via grants, that will mean a bigger impact on poorer households. That's a political choice, and it's a valid political choice. but it is a political choice. The second issue is that council tax raises less in more deprived areas. That's because despite the fact that it's a bigger share of income of poorer households' income, it's less, they pay less in absolute cash terms. And of course, because it's based on, to some extent, property value, you know, areas where property values are cheaper, particularly more deprived areas, have lower sort of payments, even if they have the same band D rate. And you can see that by looking at the budget figures for 2021-22. So whilst the overall across England as a whole, the increases in council tax would raise the equivalent to about 4% of council's core spending power if you build in, you know, MHCLG's original assumption of 1.7% tax-based growth. So I said that's a bit optimistic. But if you look across the distribution from the least deprived to the most deprived areas, you can see it raises the equivalent to about 5% in the least deprived areas compared to about 3% in the most deprived areas. So the same council tax increases, once you account for council tax base growth, raises, you know, 5% of additional funding for the the richest areas of the country, about 3% for the poorest areas of the country. Now, the government was able to offset this in the 2021-22 settlement by how it had distributed grant funding. And in particular, the social care grants were allocated according to how much councils could raise themselves via council tax. So you can see the pink bars here, the poorer areas got much more of those. It was also the case that the reductions in new homes bonus hit poorer areas less hard. And all that meant that, all that meant that once you look at the increase in overall core spending power, the little black bars or little black lines on this figure, it was fairly equal across the distribution from the least deprived to the most deprived. But that is largely because councils were compensated for their different abilities by kind of how grants were allocated. Now, looking ahead, with grants potentially frozen or even cut, that becomes much harder because you can't allocate additional grant funding to do it. You need to take grant funding off some areas to give it to others. And the government has sort of previously balked at that in the past when it came to introducing negative RSG. So I think looking ahead, you know, if funding is tight in terms of grant funding, unless the government bites the bullet and redistributes the limited grant funding that's already there, poor areas might either need to have bigger tax rises or be able to generate less additional funding to pay for higher spending. Now, the final thing I wanted to talk about, and I'll try to do this relatively quickly, is the case for reforming council tax going forwards. Now, there are two reasons, I think, why council tax reform really should be considered, and it's the same reasons that have been there for a very long time, but I think the sort of focus on levelling up and the real sort of light shone on the inequalities we have in this country shone by COVID, I think has, you know, added impetus and increased the need for considering a reform of council tax. And there are two factors, I think, which really drive that need. The first is, as you will all be aware, council tax is currently based on 1991 property values. And since then, property values have increased very differently across the country. So you can see that whereas property prices have increased around threefold in the northeast of England since the mid-1990s, they've increased around 4.7-fold across England as a whole, and over 6-fold in London. And when you look at the very local level, it's about 2.5 times in County Durham, about 9 times in, you know, Hackney, which has really sort of gentrified over the last sort of 30 years or so. Now, revaluing council tax wouldn't mean that bills go up to match these increases in property values, but it would mean that the bands or the system put in place could reflect the up-to-date relative values of properties. So we'll see that in a second. And then the other kind of key reason for reform, and why it should have been considered for a long time, but I think maybe is even more important, sort of, with levelling up and COVID, is that council tax is regressive with respect to property value. You can see that on this figure here, which shows the average tax faced by properties of different values measured as a percentage of their value. And so, for example, before council tax support, you can see that a property worth around 100,000 faces a tax of 1.2%. A property worth 200,000 faces a property tax of about 0.7%. Property worth $1 million, about 0.5%. Council tax support again ameliorates this impact, but it still is regressive with respect to property value and income after council tax support. So this year, last year, we published a report looking at what revaluing and reforming council tax could look like. This table shows if it was based on 2019 values, what the tax bands would have to be in order to have the same share of properties in each tax band. You can see that the band A-B threshold would have to go up by about 3.6 times. The band H threshold by about 5.5 times. The reason for that difference is largely because of the differences across regions. Most of the low-value properties were in areas where values are going up less. Most of the high-value properties were in areas where the values are going up more. So you need to see this kind of divergence in the tax bands. As well as looking at what the new bands would have to be, we also in this report looked at what you could do to make tax less regressive by, for example, making the band relativities more in line with the property values, or even just removing the bands completely and going for a continuous tax. And I'll show you the results of both revaluing and making it continuous to value and proportional to value in a second. Now, one of the things we found is that it's not just about reforming council tax. If you want council tax reform to help level up the country and to address some of the regional inequalities we face, you also need to adjust other funding for councils at the same time. And that's because without adjusting this other funding, each council would need to raise just as much council tax as it does now if it wanted to maintain spending. So let's say in the Northeast, if all the properties went down bands, well, the council would still need to raise just as much as now, so it would need to put up its band D rate. That means while individual properties would see their tax bills change, the average bill that authorities in the Northeast wouldn't change in London either. But if the government was to update the funding, as it has historically done, to account for how much councils can raise from council tax, given the band structure and given the sort of number of properties each council has in those different bands, if it did that, well, councils in the Northeast would get additional grant funding to compensate for their lower tax bases, and that would allow them to kind of cut their tax rates. Councils in London would get less grant funding, they'd have to put up their tax rates. And in that case, the revaluation and reform of council tax could contribute to the levelling up agenda. You get more grant and lower council tax in the North and Midlands, and less grant and higher council tax in London and its commuter belt. So to see that very quickly, this figure shows what would happen to average tax bills from just a simple revaluation based on 2019 values. Red and orange means areas where bills have fallen. Green is areas where bills would rise. See, the biggest falls in bills from revaluation would be across much of the north. Field and Wyre in Lancashire would see the biggest falls of 15% in their average bills. Hackney and Wandsworth in London would see the biggest increases, 45% and 34%. Now, outside of London, there'd only be, I think, 4 authorities that would see increases of more than 10%. Cambridge, Oxford, Bristol, and Brighton. Most areas outside of London would see falls, including actually parts of the southeast. if you also made council tax continuous and proportional to value, the changes would be much, much bigger. That's because not only would you be affecting the kind of differential change in price over the last 30 years, also the even bigger differences in the level of property prices across the country. So across large parts of the north, bills would fall by over 20%, over 40% in many cases. In parts of the southeast around London and in London itself, bills up by more than 20%, more than 40%, and in a few instances, rather a lot higher again. So the biggest falls would be in Kingston upon Hull and Blackpool. The biggest increases would be in Westminster and Kensington and Chelsea. Although note, even with this increase in Westminster, the bill would still be only a little bit higher than the national average, given the low tax rates set by Westminster Council. Our report also looks at what this means across different types of households. Making council tax more proportional to value would benefit poorer households. It would reduce their bills they pay, especially in the Midlands and North. London is the exception to that, where the high values there would mean bills going up, actually even for the poorer households on average. So that would mean needing to consider kind of special measures to kind of help low-income households, for example, more generous council tax support, especially for those in social housing, because we don't think rents would adjust there. We do think rents would likely adjust in private rental housing. It would also reduce tax bills for younger adults relative to older adults. And we have been kind of concerned about incomes of younger adults, pre-COVID, but especially, given COVID, given they've been hit harder by the economic effects of the COVID crisis. And I think that means, out of crisis, sometimes opportunity can come. The government really should revalue and reform council tax. It's got to manage to level up. The COVID crisis, I think, has reinforced that, and it's got a large majority with many MPs in northern seats, the kind of areas that would benefit from this. So whilst it'll be politically difficult, the kind of the impetus for this and the politics have changed. There'll be lots of things to think about, and happy to kind of take questions on these. But I think we are in a place now where we can kind of start to think about council tax reform as one of the potential opportunities for a more rational and a fairer system of local government funding coming out of the COVID crisis. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. We're now going to move on to the Q&A part of the webinar. We've got just a little under 20 minutes, which hopefully is a good amount of time. And I think we've had a lot of questions coming in, which I'll just have a quick review of, and we'll try and start to put those to our speakers. And do please, obviously it's not like you've missed your opportunity. If you do have any other questions that occur to you as we move through the discussion, then please do pop them in the box. I can see that someone is asking if copies of the slides will be available, and I think we could make that available. Also, just to everyone, let everybody know, we're recording this webinar, so we'll be hosting the recording on the CIPFA YouTube channel it should be available in the next day or two. So if you want to review any of the presentations or the discussion, or you want to share it with a colleague, then you'll be able to do so there. So just to kick us off, maybe just picking up some of the things that David was just talking about at the end there, about the kind of politics of council tax reform. I mean, David and Joe, what are your views on the sort of political will behind really grasping the nettle and reforming the council tax? I mean, is that really realistic, do you think? Are we in a slightly new political reality that makes that more likely? Don't know who wants to go first.
Well, I'll take a shot at that initially. I think that we are in a very different world, and COVID has changed what we know, but council tax reform has been on the agenda for many, many years and been discussed in a significant amount of reports, Merleys, Lyons. I supported some work on London Commission. There's lots and lots of pieces of work around council tax reform. So there's a plethora of examples and discussions and opportunities for us to learn from. But I think, as David's slides have pointed out, we're now in a critical position with regards to funding. Funding not just through council tax, but the whole of local government funding. I mean, if you add to that the context of, social care, there was an NAO report only last week about the increases in charges to do with that. You've also got changes around business rates, the move to digital and the concerns around our high street. So I think that it's a necessary area and discussion to have and to take place. And I would certainly hope that the political will is there. It's finding that political bandwidth. And my concern, just before I sort of pass over to David, is that there's recognition that this has to be cross-parliamentary and cross-political support for this, because this isn't a sort of a year exercise. This is a long-term commitment if we're to get it right, and that's what's needed in just before we even start that conversation, and hopefully we can get parties involved. And I know CIPFA, IFS will happily contribute to that discussion.
Yes, no, I would agree with what Joe says there. I mean, I think my view is that the politics of this will always be difficult. When you leave something for 30 years, the kind of changes are going to create many winners, but also many losers, and the losers will be more vocal about it. But I think the politics of this have somewhat changed in the last, couple of years. I think one of the kind of key factors is what happened in 2019 in the election. We saw the Conservatives pick up a whole bunch of seats in the areas that would gain most from revaluation of a form of council tax. It'll want to kind of hold on to those seats. One way it could try to do that would be to offer policies that would be beneficial to people living in those kind of seats. Council tax revaluation reform would be one of those. I think we've also seen, moves to do this again in Wales. So the Welsh government actually commissioned a whole bunch of research on reforming and revaluing council tax and land value tax and so on and so forth. We'll see if that makes it into the Labour manifesto in Wales. It's already in the sort of Plaid Cymru manifesto. Now, the reason I mentioned this is that what you see sometimes is that when devolved governments have kind of reformed taxes, that has sometimes prompted debate and change in England. So we saw that with stamp duty land tax when the changes in England mirrored changes that were made in Scotland. I think this is a little bit different politically, but I think you could see if you see more chat about this elsewhere in the UK, that can sometimes kind of prompt things in England as well. And I think third, we've seen much more concern recently about concerns about inequality between places, especially how different types of areas will fare in the kind of post-COVID world. So I think that this will be difficult. It will be hard to get this through, but I think it's some things have moved in the right direction. And the question, I'm not saying right now, but if not in the next 2 years, when will it be? Because will we end up in a situation where we've got council tax in 2091 based on 1991 values? How do you even do that? How do you even actually estimate those values at that point? When the kind of country would have changed so much. So I think it really is a nettle that has to be grasped at some stage, and I hope it's in the next couple of years.
Thanks, David. We've had a question that's quite a nice supplementary to that. The Chancellor's spoken quite a lot about reforming property tax sort of as a whole, I think the questioner means, scrapping stamp duty and council tax and replacing both with something new. So what do speakers think about that proposal? Not reforming council tax, but actually just replacing it with something new and perhaps as part of the wider property tax kind of ecosystem. David, do you want to have a crack at that, and then we'll go through?
So I think the question might be kind of like, might have seen the proposals by a campaign group called Fair Share, who have proposed, basically a reform which means, a proportional property tax to replace council tax and to replace stamp duty. I think there's much to commend that idea. Stamp duty is one of the most damaging taxes we have. It prevents transactions, that will be mutually beneficial, because if the property doesn't change hands, you get no tax. If it changes hands, you get tax on it. So people end up, being less able to trade up and less able to trade down. It reduces mobility to take jobs. If you own a house, you've got to kind of like weigh up the cost of, the fact that, you'll get less for it because stamp duty is going to be paid by the buyer. So I think abolishing stamp duty, reforming council tax and making up the revenue via a reformed council tax would be a very sensible idea. I think what we've seen in recent years, though, is, if anything, kind of an increased reliance on stamp duty, because I think as well as, doing what's kind of efficient and fair, the other thing the Chancellor will be thinking about is how can he kind of pluck the goose with the least amount of hissing. And you tend to find that taxes which, take place when there's a kind of a transaction, or which you don't see, really, like income tax, it comes out your salary and you don't see it, those cause less consternation than a tax bill you pay yourself out of your pocket every year, like council tax. So I would like to see this happen, but I think the Chancellor will be balancing not only the sort of economics and the kind of fairness kind of side of the politics, but also the sort of the salience and the kind of like the viewability of the tax, if you like.
Jo, do you have any thoughts on something brand new?
I think we've got to put everything into the pot and consider it all. I think that we mustn't rule anything out when we're thinking about reform, because I think you've got to go back to the basics about what's local government for, how do you fund it, what is it expected to deliver. But you've got to go back to almost first principles and start to question what is the expectation and how then do we fund it, and is that a very is that the right approach? So we need to go through all of these and work out what is equitable, what is fair, and what is long term. So you don't want to be you're not going to be changing a system in the next 5 years. My only comment about things like changing a property tax, and I can understand why that's gone into the pot, is that one of the things about council tax in its current state is that it's links very closely with accountability to local government and to to the electorate. So there's a sort of quite a clean link there with actually the accountable process within local government. And I don't know, I'm not sure whether that would still be there with that type of property tax, but it might be. And I think, and funnily enough, I was just having a look through my notes. So that was one of the discussions we had at the Commission on Local Government Finance, and I think that it really should all go into the pot.
If I can come back, I agree very much with what Jo was saying about local accountability. So I think the other thing that the Fair Share campaign has suggested is that actually there could be some local discretion, but this would be largely a national tax. I think actually that is quite a tricky proposition, because first of all, I think it is important that local areas have some discretion and control, and council tax is one way it gives that, because the people that live in the houses are the ones that pay the bill, and it has that democratic accountability. That's also why, for example, if you think about further devolution of taxes, I kind of would favour income tax over, for example, corporation tax or VAT. You've got that direct link between the voters and the taxpayers. I think the difficulty in kind of making council tax, replacing it with a national property tax, is at the moment, some councils are raising more from council tax and some have chosen to set lower rates to raise less. Do you remove that discretion? That is, effectively kind of like taking away local ability to kind of say, well, we'll raise more to spend more and vice versa. If you don't do that, if you don't kind of take that away, if you have a national tax rate, do you constantly subsidize areas that were previously charging higher rates to kind of maintain their higher spending, despite the fact they're now facing the national tax, and penalize areas that had lower taxes? So I think there's a whole bunch of issues when you start kind of saying, let's replace the local taxes with a national tax. So I think if you do kind of reform council tax and revalue and so on, and merge it with stamp duty, that's great. But I still think keep it a local tax.
It's funny, we've actually just had a question in about redistribution and the council tax, actually. Is national council tax redistribution as per business rates, which have the system of tariffs and top-ups, is that kind of redistribution inevitable, given council tax makes up an increasing proportion of local government funding? Or does that, this is me, not the questioner, does that kind of drive a coach and horses through the idea of local spending?
I think on that, already there is implicitly a system of redistribution according to council tax. It's kind of the resource adjustment that kind of sits as part of the sort of calculation of revenue support grant and actually baseline funding that drives then the tariffs and top-ups and business rates. So there already is that system. At the moment, it's kind of messed up. They introduced a really stupid system called the 4-block model. Some of you might remember from the mid-2000s, and then they completely got rid of that. In the last few years, we've basically been kind of running a system which is all still based on what was happening in the mid-2000s. In the fair funding review, they need to put in place a proper system to do this again. I think that becomes increasingly important as you rely on council tax to raise more funding. If you don't have a system to do that redistribution, as council tax goes up and up and it makes up a bigger share, the poor areas will fall behind because they can't raise so much from it. I think it'd be even more important again if you do this reform to council tax to make it more progressive, because whilst that will make it more progressive for households, this more progressive tax would raise less in the Blackpools and the Hulls, so that they'll be even more reliant on the redistributed funding via how the RSG and baseline funding is calculated. So absolutely kind of spot on question. It is vital. It'll become more important over time. We have a system there that just needs to be kind of made rational and sensible looking forward. It's not this sort of slightly decrepit, archaic system we have at the moment.
I mean,
I don't know if Joanne, your thoughts on that.
Have you got any further thoughts, Joe? Or
yeah, no. I mean, redistribution is always a hot topic, because once you start going down that, then the formulas for redistribution are an absolute nightmare in many instances. But you need a system of redistribution, because I mean, particularly when you've got examples at the moment where we're emphasising the adult social care and the ability of areas to raise income for adult social care. And that definitely is not allocated on the areas of need. So you've got to, because I mean, you will never have a system where income is generated perfectly for the need of that area, and other areas are all working effectively. I mean, you would need then you start to almost talk about the reorganisation of local government into a wider and slightly different form, which is maybe a different conversation, but it has to be a redistribution method. And what that redistribution method has to have is it has to be very transparent and understandable, and it has to ensure that everybody within it is support to the extent that it can, that supports those principles, so that you don't have areas that are rewarded for failure simply because of the redistribution. But that again is the mechanisms that needs to be generated as part of that discussion.
Thanks, Jo. It's 2 o'clock by my clock, so I think I probably need to bring the webinar to a close here. Thank you all for attending. We've had over 100 people online today, so that's been brilliant. As I said earlier, we're going to be making a recording of this webinar available on the YouTube channel, so that should be there in the next day or two. Keep your eyes peeled for that. But before I wind up, I just want to thank Joanne, Pitt and David Phillips again for their excellent contributions today and their really thoughtful contributions to the Q&A in the last 20 minutes or so. And thanks to our audience for joining us today. We do really appreciate it. Thank you again.